So, welcome again, everyone. Thank you for patience. I wasn't prepared for this, so we are a little bit late. So let me start from the very beginning. First of all, going straight to the topic of this presentation. Every single time when a game studio starts talking with a composer, and probably especially when this is a first talk with a composer which they want to hire for the very first time, they go into this, very dramatic talk about the budget. So, and this is the game, this game of the ping pong game, which they make, probably ends up in some or other way. But very rarely it's. But very rarely it ends with some satisfaction for both sides, basically. Because I think the biggest misunderstanding that we have in a game dev is that music is very unlike the sound design. Is very much very often is treated as additional service, completely detached from entire game production process. And very often composer is asked to do some music without even interfering too much with the gameplay, or rather with the game production, I mean. And while everybody on the team, they work very hard on every single part, they also iterate the game, they change it, the game evolves. And with the music, it's very often like, we think that, okay, we need some music, so we have to do it, and then we assume that it's going to be fine at the first take, and we don't need to really, we don't need to really iterate it. We can just assume that the composer will get in, get out, and everything is going to be fine, and we move on, we release the game, and it's great. And that is why very often the most basic question is this one: how much is 1 minute of music? And we will try to discover an answer for this question today. But before we do that, I would like to ask one additional question, and this is how much is 1 minute of gameplay? Or maybe this is too wide, probably, right? Because there are so many variables, it's really difficult to say anything about it, because you can't really predict that huge range of production. On that huge range, you can't really predict how this is gonna end up. So maybe let's narrow it. How much is one line of code? Anyone? Any ideas? How much is one line of code? Well, believe it or not, but with music, it's very much the same. It's a very similar process, basically. And I believe very strongly that when we want to somehow have a control on a production, on a project, basically, when we want to have a control on a budget, when we want to have a control on costs, on expenses, it's very difficult to make choices when we don't really know anything about the process itself. And you know what? When I started thinking about this speech, and it was like almost 2 years ago, I thought that I will make a poll, and I asked as many game developers as I could to answer some questions. And sorry, this is the next slide. And one of the questions which I asked was, who established the budget in your game, and how? And the most common answer was CEO establishes the budget, but nobody knows how. So that is why this question of how much is 1 minute of music is almost impossible to answer. And that is why, because 1 minute of music can be something like this. Okay, it's very hard. The quality of the sound. Maybe I will lower this here, and you can push it up there the volume. Ooh, it's very bad. Sorry, it doesn't sound like that. But what I mean, this is a chunk of the game, the Sin Collector Repentless, which is about to be released next month by Scelina Studio. And this game contains music which is very much ambient, electronic, dark. This is the sound. And how do you compare this type of music and assume that there is some price per minute, where on the other hand you have something like this? Yeah, and this is a piece of music from a digital edition of board game site created by Jakub Różalski. And what I mean by choosing some differences, for me at least, the biggest problem, or rather the biggest factor which we need to take in account is not only the fact of production quality, but mostly, sorry, I will mute this. But mostly what I mean is complexity of arrangement and also a different style of music. Because at least for me, it requires completely different creative muscles to do something like for the synth collector, which is very dark, ambient, and electronic, and completely different kind of skill set and also different muscles, different kind of thinking when I need to make something which is more like orchestral music, like in this case. So that is why this, the fact who estimates and how is very important, because if I, for instance, if I would like to build a house, which I know nothing about technology, I know nothing about how different technologies differ price-wise, and I know nothing about different tasks which are required to build a house, I wouldn't even be aware of how to ask about it. So I would probably have to blindly trust the builder and the architect and everybody around. So, you know, and give them money as much as they want to be able to build this house, right? So very often people who runs studios, they are like completely professionals in the game dev industry. They make their games probably working on different on different aspects of the games over the years, but most of the time they don't really have an experience with music and music production mostly. So that is why it's very, you know, it's unwise to aware, or rather for them to be aware what is the process and what it takes actually to make that 1 minute of music, which we talk about all the time. So that is why I thought that it would be also a good idea to show you just roughly what is the process, what is the idea, or rather maybe some example of a pipeline, what the music production can look like in some scenarios. And of course, don't please treat this as a, you know, as a template. This is not something that will work with everything, because every game may require different kind of approach, and also different studios may require different kind of approaches. So, you know, this is just an example. And I will very quickly, and also I will try very quickly, go through all of these stages here. So first of all, this is something that I borrowed in pre-production. As you can see, we have 3 stages: pre-production, production, and post-production. And this is what I borrowed from a film industry spotting session. This is something, this is the moment basically where the composer and the director, or maybe some producers, they sit down and they watch the film, or in our case, the game, and they talk about how this music's supposed to work in this specific project, what it's supposed to do in a given moment, and also what kind of emotion we want to provoke when we hear this music in a given moment. And of course, about some type of mechanics in the game and so on and so forth. Next, we have things like music concepts, and this is great for developers because they often use some references. They send, this is probably something you also know, we use some references from other games, we listen to different music from other projects, which is helpful also, but what I like to do, the process which I like personally, is the music design, because it allows us in pre-production, on very early stage of the production of the game, we can try to imagine and we can try to predict what do we really want this music to do in this game. Do we only want this music to be some sort of a background which has nothing to do with the story, with the setting of the game, and it's just building some sort of, I don't know, like the mood in the background, and that's it? Or do we really want this music to be a part of the game and somehow just crossfades with the story? And then when we make this music design, we can actually create some sort of a prototype of adaptive music system, and this is something what I called here with the short name AMS. adaptive music system, because we can make some sort of a demo. Composer can make a demo, and we can put this into adaptive music system. We can test it in a game, and we can just see if it works or not. And then what for me at least is important, I always, when I start a new project, I build some sort of a template, and DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, which is basically, in other words, just our program, our music program, which we work in. And for me, it's Cubase for many years. Excuse me. So what I mean by template, almost always, I always try to prepare some sort of an empty project which already has some built-in, some preloaded virtual instruments, which I can just easily use all along while working on different cues. Because every single time when I need to start a new cue, right, I don't want to waste time on loading everything again and again. So that was my idea behind creating a template for every single project. And then we move to production, which in shortcut, music composition, obviously there are different ways and methods, but there is something which is specifically interesting, I think, in our process, and creating mock-ups, so / demos. When we know on some early stage that we want to record some live instruments, I believe that even that we know that we go to the studio eventually, I believe it's good to make some sort of a demo using virtual instruments so that we can then put those small chunks which we prepare, and this is what I call asset preparation, preparing all of the loops, all of the small slices of the music which are required for our adaptive music system, and then we can put it into some middleware like Wise or Fmod, and we can test it. And of course, then we can iterate it and iterate it. Maybe we will change something in our system, or maybe we will go back to even to the composition, and maybe we'll change arrangement. And because we are working on a demo stage, we are using just virtual instruments, it's easy, or maybe not so easy, but still it's not so expensive because we are still working on a computer. And then when we go to post-production, this is what I consider creating this final, let's say, final sound of the score. Preparing a recording session, making recordings, mixing and mastering, and then the most dangerous part, which is asset replacement. Because when we make everything again, what we previously created with this, let's say, demo version, then we need to replace it in our Wise or Fmod or even in engine itself directly. And this can, of course, fall apart, and everything can break somehow because we can make some mistakes during the process. So there is another idea. We can avoid replacing those assets just by moving around those little elements, and we can record everything before we put this into the game. But of course, there is another danger, because if we record everything in a studio when we decide we want some live recordings, and then we put the music into the game, and after that fact, we realize that something is wrong and we need to go back and change something, this will require that we have to record it again. So we have to hire, again, musicians, and we have to, of course, rent studio for another session. So that is why it's also dangerous, and there is no perfect solution for this. That is why I'm showing this mostly as an example. And also, speaking of examples, I have one more thing which I would like to share with you, and this is more or less how we work when we make music. And we use, on a computer, we can use virtual instruments, which most of the time are sample-based instruments. But when we use sample-based instruments, and when we know that we won't record anything live, we can actually somehow figure out how to make a composition to the strength of the samples. So we can do it to the degree that samples can handle it. We won't make anything, very fancy maybe. We are just trying to limit our resources of articulations and sounds, just to make it as good as possible while using samples. And that is why sometimes when we work on this kind of production, we can get more or less, let's say, realistic results doing something like this. While it's almost impossible when you want to do something like this with samples. You see, samples are like textures, like images, like photos. So when we have, let's say we have a texture and we want to put this texture on our environment. We want to have an environment with gravel, so we have this gravel texture, right? We put it on. And then we decide that we want some part of this environment to have a grass texture. So we add this grass texture, and then we create some sort of a mask, which will make a smooth transition from one texture to another. But, sorry. Sometimes even if we want to make more organic, more realistic transitions, we can just simply take a brush and we can just paint some details, right? We can just make it almost seamless transition from one material to another. But with music, with sound, it's completely different because there is no equivalent of a brush in a sound, or at least not direct one. So when we use a sample-based instrument, or rather, when we sample an instrument, we take an instrument like harmonica, for instance, and we record every single sound separately, like this. And then all of those chunks, all of those samples, we can just manage them to create some sort of a melody. But only by having those single sounds, it is impossible to create a performance which would be more like, for instance. So that is why it's very often very hard to decide, are samples enough for us? Because on some, in some music styles, for instance, it's going to be easier to use samples than on the others. And very often this decision is very hard to make, especially when game developer doesn't have comparison, because they don't really know, if it's possible to do something with samples, or they can't even hear because they can't imagine how it's going to sound like when recorded live. That is why I thought it's going to be cool experiment to show you some part of the music, some small piece of music, which I prepared, recorded with some virtual instruments, with virtual quartet for a small indie game, Jimmy. And this is just the main theme. And this is also something that I like to call a hybrid production, because eventually I used a live string quartet and also some sample-based instruments, some percussion and some other elements like woodwinds. But here is my arrangement in MIDI with those sample-based string quartet. Shouldn't sound like that. The bass is killing it. And now you'll hear the live performance. Okay, so now let's move to the business. So, who studio really hires? Well, most of the time, at least on our yard, most of the time studio hires composers, and that's it. So we have to, if we are able, we can hire some other professionals and create some sort of a team to fill all the gaps and to make the final product, basically. So here are just a couple of ideas who can be in the team. Of course, obviously composer, there can be of course an assistant if required, or maybe even more assistants if required, orchestrator who will make sure that everything is fine. Of course, some of these jobs can be done by a single person. Some people are so skilled, of course, that they can do it by themselves, but it's really difficult to be great in everything. And also the time, when the time is concerned, sometimes it's better to hire those more of those professionals just to make this job quicker. Of course, musician, recording engineer, mixing engineer, mastering engineer, of course this can be single person, but the job is a little bit different. And also one of the things which I recall from yesterday's speech of Paweł, who's here, not everyone can be perfect in everything, so sometimes people can give away the part of adaptive music system programming to someone else, just so they can focus on just music, and someone else can just do it in Wise, in Fmont, or even directly in the game engine. So that is why this is more or less how it can look like. And what about deals, licenses, and copyrights, and other disasters? The reality these days looks like this, that we have a couple of ways how we work today. We have the most probably common method of, or rather the most common deal, which is a flat fee, which in film industry and in TV industry is also called front end. And this is basically a single fee for everything. And also very often it also includes all expenses for the production. So if composer gets X amount of money, he or she has to somehow figure out how to do everything, the recordings, paying musicians, paying the studio, perhaps even hiring engineer, and so on and so forth. So very often is a gambling game because we are, especially at the beginning of the process, because we don't really know, even the studio that doesn't know how this game is going to end up. So we don't know either. So we are gambling with the money somehow to figure out how to do it without spending everything. And there are some cases when composer spends more money than gets and basically ends up with the debt. What also a game and TV industry created this kind of model for many years was that composer would get some X amount of money, like a flat fee for creating a film or the writing a score for a film or TV show, and then every single time when this would be on air, some royalties will get back. So, and that's why we call it back end. But the problem is that in game industry there is no back end because there is no emission. There's nothing like that, at least for now. So it's a little bit different. There are almost no royalties in this industry. However, very often, especially in the game industry, is this so-called per minute rate, which is a little bit safer, I believe, than the flat fee for a composer, because especially when we don't really know how much work there's going to be during this entire process, which may take 1, 2, 3 years, who knows. It's a little bit safer for the composer because for every single minute of the music they make, they will get paid, basically. And there, of course, are things regarding copyrights. The most common thing is buyout of copyrights in the game industry, not so common in film and TV. And this is something that Mike also mentioned during his speech about voice acting. This is something that's probably maybe will change someday because there are some movements which are trying to force some sort of royalties in this business and changing those deals, but not for now. There are also some other deals like exclusive license, which is just a little bit different than buying out copyrights. Because, for instance, the license, even if it's exclusive, it can be limited, not even to time or to region, but also it can be limited to the media. So let's say the studio has that exclusive license to use the music in a game. but nothing else. So the composer can actually sell the music, let's say, to a film or whatever, to some documentary. So there is another way to do it, right? And finally, even more open kind of deal when we have a non-exclusive license. So basically, studio gets the right to use the music without, of course, any limitations. But the composer has the right also to resell it to some other parties. And moving, okay, to some idea, because I would like to show you some idea which is completely, it's completely subjective, but I have some alternative deal to consider also for you as maybe audio people and maybe developers to consider making music design and the prototype first, so hiring composer before making this entire decision of the budget for entire game. Just you can hire a composer for this first pre-production. You can work on the music design, on the prototype, maybe on some hour-like fee or something like this, like everybody else in a company, and then you can eventually, when you have this prototype and basically you have more knowledge about how this music is going to be eventually, it's going to be easier for developer and also for the composer. It's going to be easier to figure out what could be the budget for the final product. So yeah, that's the second thing. And of course, there is another way, especially when you want to lower the composer fee. I'm sure that many composers would find this interesting deal that you can just split the income from sales and give some percentage to the composer when you want, the composer to work maybe for just a little bit lower rate. That's another idea. And regarding all of the expenses during the production, I mean the music production, when I said that we as composers, we also have to pay for other things like the studio musicians, and maybe covering mixing, mastering, and maybe some other stuff. We live, especially when we are hired on this per minute rate fee, we live sort of in a parallel universe because no one else works this way, not even programmers, right? They don't get charged by lines of code. So when we hire, or rather when we rent a studio, we have to pay per hour, per day. When we hire musicians, we also pay per studio time, per hour, or maybe per piece of music. And we also need to sometimes hire an orchestrator, maybe a copyist, so they would probably charge per a cue, which they have to work on. Similar way, a recording engineer per hour or maybe per day. A little bit different with mixing, because with mixing, it's very dependent on how big arrangement is. So very many mixing engineers, they would charge differently for a piece of music which has like 3 instruments and it's like maybe 5 tracks, and different for a full orchestra which has like 150 tracks or whatever. So this is also important to be aware of. That's why the first deal which I mentioned the flat fees, that is so very dangerous, because we don't really know, especially when we have some revisions. When there is a revision and we have to go back to the studio and we are hired based on the flat fee, we have to pay it from our own money, basically. So that is why it's a little bit dead end sometimes. Okay, but how much, right? How much? What's the composer fee? Well, of course, there is no straight answer, and I really like the poll which Game Sound Con makes every single year. These are the most common answers which I found. So these are not all the answers which they published, but these are the most popular ones. And as you can see, very interestingly, the most popular fee per minute for a composer is $1,000 for AAAs as well as for indies. So this is like of course, they don't take into account very important factors like location, for instance, because we can all agree that it's going to be probably a little bit different for someone who lives in Los Angeles, and probably very much different for us in Poland, because even life expenses are completely different. So we have to somehow, figure it out how to use this data. And then, of course, there are some things which we pay for most of the time, like the studio and musicians. And here are just a couple of examples, just to give you some rough idea what are the differences, basically. So first of all, what I have on a list is a Tricon studio in Germany, and this is relatively small studio, which charges $500 for a studio per day, and this is interesting, $300 for a recording engineer per song. So I believe this is probably something that can be customized, especially if we have like 20 10-second cues to record. But yeah, this is the most common thing they do in Tricon Studio. Funkhaus, on the other hand, in Berlin, it's much bigger studio, which is capable of recording orchestra, and they charge $800 for a day, and custom pricing for engineers, so we don't really know. Monochrome Studio, this is a studio which you could see in at least at some part, in the video, because this is the studio where I recorded the string quartet in Poland. And they charge around, because it's different currency, because in Polish zlotys it's a different value, but it's roughly $450 for a day in a studio, and an engineer is included. Unless, like me, you want to go there with your own engineer, so you have to pay for the engineer extra. And at the end we have Sofia Session Studio, which average, because it always depends on the size of the orchestra, but this is one of the examples. They charge $2,500 for a studio, and the recording engineer is included. All right, so how much, right? Musicians and other stuff. Well, it's not going to be fair if I try to somehow answer this question, how much do we pay for musicians? Because it can be $100 per day for a single musician if this is, let's say, some sort of a student, and it can be even like $2,000 per day if this is some sort of popular musician who just has higher rates. So it all depends, of course. And the same thing goes with recording engineers, mixing, and stuff like that. But on average, I always try to keep in mind that somewhere around $500 per day for a musician is like is a very good rate. Maybe not in Poland. Maybe for Poland would be a little bit lower, but it also all depends on the musician and, of course, the project itself. So it's always very, very fluid. But there is one thing which I am a fan of, especially when I work with some smaller projects. I already mentioned this sort of hybrid production. This is one of the ways how you can optimize the budget, because if you know that the budget is tight and you know that you won't be able to record everything live, well, you can make some sort of hybrid production, which means that maybe 60% of the music will be based on samples and some virtual instruments, and the rest will take by live instruments, maybe some soloists, and just a couple of recordings here and there, just to improve the quality and the performance of the music. Sorry. And moving on, I have here an example of some sort of estimation of a budget, which basically all follows based on some sort of, I just assumed that there is a project, and we somehow, during this music design process, we established that we need around 30 adaptive music tracks, music assets. And we need one track for the menu, and we need, for instance, 10 cutscenes music. So in total, we have 41 tracks. And let's see what this is going to lead us to. We also decided, based on the music design which we made in the pre-production, that we will focus mostly on this kind of instruments: woodwinds, strings, ethnic percussion, guitar, and harp. And then we move on, and we think, okay, but we want to cut our expenses somehow, so we decided we will use this ethnic percussion and the harp only as sample-based instruments. So we won't record this live, we will record just all of the rest instruments live, and we will keep this as a virtual ones. And then of course, we need to somehow establish how much time of those recordings we need. This is, well, basically this is gambling again, but more or less, we can establish, based on the music we have in mind, that we need around 30 minutes of string quartet recording. I mean, like the final recordings. 40 minutes for the guitar, 30 minutes for flute, 30 minutes for a bassoon, and total 130 minutes. So when we try to figure out, okay, how much time do we need to record this? And this is also, I think, interesting because in the poll which I mentioned at the beginning, I also asked developers to guess how much music we can record during 1 hour long session. And some of the answers, of course, it wasn't the most common, but some answers were 1 hour. No, this is totally impossible. We can't record 1 hour music in 1 hour recording session, during 1 hour recording session. We can do, let's say, 5 minutes, but this is also very much dependent on the skills of the musicians which we have and difficulty of the material. Because when we hire, let's say, some quote-unquote cheaper musicians, which are, let's say, students, maybe just post-graduated, and they don't have so much skills, they can need more time to repeat and repeat and repeat. So this is going to take much more studio time. So it's much more difficult to establish some sort of right number for the amount of minutes which we are able to record in 1 hour recording session. But more or less, let's say 5 minutes. This is, I think, believable. So knowing that we need to record 130 minutes, when we divide it into 5, we have 26 hours. And of course, we could probably crunch so much that we would be able to do it in 2 days, but I would rather go to 3 or maybe even 4 if I would lucky and I would have money to do it. But let's say 3 days it is possible to do it. And then, of course, we need to sum up how much all of the music is required. So 60 minutes of adaptive music, 3 minutes for the menu, and 12 minutes average, for cutscenes. So in total, we have 75 minutes of music. And this is more or less the calculation. And as you can see, the composer fee, which I used here in this calculation, is $500 per minute. And this is, let's say, something that I thought it would be like somewhere in the middle, in between those most popular answers from the poll, which I showed you, where we had like $1,000 per minute, which was the most popular, but we also had like 200, I believe, almost at the lower end. So 500 is probably somewhere in between. Multiplied by 75 minutes, we have $35,500. Studio, let's say we decided to book some middle-sized studio for $600 per day. We need 3 days that we know, so we need $1,800. Musicians, I also presume that I need, let's say, $500 per musician, and we need 7 of them for a day, so we need $3,500 for musicians. And for mixing, I actually use a little bit low value, to be honest, but let's say we have a good friend which is mixing engineer, and he will give us, or she will give us, very generous discount, and we'll do it for $100 per queue. So this leads us to $4,100. So as you can see, in total, when we sum up everything, we have $46,900. And to sum up everything, as I mentioned before, please don't treat this as a template. This is something that you could use, hopefully, to communicate with your composer or with other composers, just to come up with some values and maybe find a middle ground. But if you don't, don't worry. There's always someone who will make it cheaper, right? Cheer up. And thank you very much for listening. My name is Patryk, Scelina, and you can find me there. Thank you. Sorry for problems at the beginning. If you have any questions, I hope I can answer them. If not, we can drink a beer later.
Thank you for this talk.
Thank you, Paul.
That was a really good one. And just one more question, because I'm somehow, I wouldn't say missing, but I have a question, simply.
Yeah.
Because this is what I learned very quickly. Like, I'm inside music production for just 3 years, but revisions and iterations, I always write down in my contract how many revisions, iterations, and what is the extent that we can revise. And I'm also putting this in a budget, and what's your approach to it, and how would you try to fit it in what you presented, what was useful?
Oh yeah, this is a tricky one, right? It's always tricky probably for every profession, for concept artists, for graphic designers, especially when they work as freelancers. Revisions is always tricky part because, of course, we want to deliver the best project, the best product we can, obviously. And, well, it's very rare for me, so I envy you, Pavel, that you have this in contract. I wasn't so wise at the beginning, so I don't have really established like the pattern which I would follow every single time. So I believe that with every project is a little bit different. And yeah, sometimes it's a trap, you know. It's difficult to avoid some problems, but that is why I also advise to trying making this music design first, and maybe trying to hire a composer first, or making some first steps, just pre-production, so that you can, the both sides, they can know more or less how this is going to end up. So they can, you know, predict in some degree. But if you ask me if I have any solution, no, I don't. Sorry.
I might be able to just maybe slightly answer your question.
Oh, perfect, please.
Because you and I, we attended both the workshop with AP Kaczmarek at the Gdynia school. And he said that one of the good ways to go about it is to just avoid revisions, right?
Yeah.
So, and one way to avoid revisions is just to like very strongly with game people kind of agree upon something before you start working, right? So if you strongly both agree upon something, they probably would kind of feel unfair,
yeah, sure,
if they want a
sure,
revision
of course,
from you, right?
Well, I'll be, at least for this moment, I was so lucky that I didn't have like huge revision process in any project I worked on. So it's maybe that is why I don't have this in my contract for start. Yeah, but who knows? Thanks.
So I guess that making this prototype first really decreases the chance of revisions, right? Because you agree on some things and so on. But I wonder, how do you convince a developer or a producer or anybody who's in charge of the process to first create these mock-ups, these first assumptions and so on?
Well, to be honest, I convinced one, so it's not a huge number. But it went great because, well, first of all, I was trying to convince them using the most probably visual aspect, showing lower numbers of the cost, because we can, we can somehow make this a little bit cheaper, because we won't waste money on, let's say, recordings things many times, because we will have some better understanding what we really want to get. When we make this prototype and when we make this demo. So that was my sneaky way of convincing them. But yeah, it's...
So just say that in total it will decrease the costs?
Yeah, I believe, and decrease the time. And to be honest, it worked. I mean, we didn't finish game yet because it's still in development, but the prototype which we tested gives us all better understanding, and also me, which ideas which I thought that are great, like, the best idea I had on paper, it was completely wrong when we put it into the game. So even for me, it was like revelating to see that this idea, which I thought was perfect, didn't work in a game.
Thanks.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, guys, for listening, and hope to see you.